Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. My name is Matt Albertson. I'm a co-chair for the Philadelphia chapter for the Society for American Baseball Research. That's your Connie Mack-Allen chapter. And I'm really happy to be here with you tonight to discuss a really interesting topic of 19th century baseball. With us tonight is author Ed Achorn. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist for commentary and the winner of the Yankee Quill Award for lifetime service to journalism, and is the former vice president and editorial pages editor for the Providence Journal. His new book about Abraham Lincoln, Every Drop of Blood, was named one of the best books of 2020 by Economist magazine. He is the author of two acclaimed books about 19th century baseball and American culture, 59 and 84, and tonight's topic, The Summer of Beer and Whiskey. He lives in an 1840 farmhouse in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. So we might be able to get to talk about that during the Q&A session. And here's my worn copy, Ed. I've gone through it a bit. There's a cigar wrapper in there as my bookmark.
Awesome.
So
awesome.
I will allow you to take over and go from there.
I think I'll try to pull up the PowerPoint here. All right, slideshow from the beginning. Can everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, it's an honor to spend some time tonight with people who really love baseball, especially in the city with such a rich history of baseball as Philly. It's a city that looms large in this book. It's quite fascinating, I think, to look at the places where baseball was thriving in the 19th century. It's New York, Boston, St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And they're still the places where people have this incredible passion for baseball. So I thought I'd show you a little bit about what I've been working on over the years. This was my first baseball book, 59 and 84, about Hall of Famer Old Hoss Radbourn, a very cranky and hard drinking man who was in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He won at least 59 games in a single season, 1884, pitching for the Providence Grays in the National League. And then he won all 3 games of baseball's first World Series. And that's obviously a stunning number for a pitcher, the most ever. And he pitched day after day, game after game, more than 678 innings in that one season, which is a mind-blowing number. And I plunged into research on this book because I wanted to know how a human being could do that and to share that story with readers. A relative said that he drank up to a quart of whiskey a day at the height of his career. So that might have helped. And he was so ornery that he was apparently the first man ever photographed giving the middle finger. You might notice what he's doing there with his left hand there on the cover of the book. And he did that in a team photo too. And when this baseball card was showing that pose was auctioned off in 2017, it sold for 24 times its original estimate. And I'd like to think this book had something to do with that. This is the second book, Summer Beer and Whiskey, which is the one I'm talking about tonight. It's the tale of the 1883 Philadelphia Athletics and one of the greatest pennant races in history. And it's also about the way immigrants, especially the owner of the St. Louis Browns here on the cover, Chris Vonderay, saved baseball. This book is still selling very well 9 years after its publication, and I think the title probably didn't hurt. In my latest book, I turned to another famous 19th century figure. Every Drop of Blood covers 24 hours in Abraham Lincoln's life, from the evening of March 3rd, 1865, through his second inauguration to the evening of March 4th, 1865. And it draws in many of the people who were around him that day, like Walt Whitman covering the event for the New York Times, and the great Black leader Frederick Douglass, and the photographer Alexander Gardner, and the stormy Mary Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, who was actually stalking Lincoln at the inauguration. And I think he intended to kill him that day. He got him 6 weeks later. Through the experiences of these people, I tried to reveal the immense suffering unleashed by the Civil War and help unfold the ultimate meaning of that war, as Lincoln explained it in his greatest and most profound speech. And if you like history, I hope you check that out. Back to my past, speaking of the 1880s, here's my great-grandfather, Adelbert Achorn, in the 1880s with his wife and kids. And the one that looks like he's wearing a dress is my grandfather, Ed Achorn. They're on the left. They were fans of the Boston Bean Eaters of the National League, later the Boston Braves. Here's my grandfather around 1900. He's got that strange looking bat there. He was a pretty good semi-pro player. And I, by contrast, was probably the worst Little League player in history. He courted my grandmother at the 1914 World Series, which happened to be played at the 2-year-old Fenway Park. Boston Braves versus Philadelphia Athletics. I like the news guys up there on the roof. There were no OSHA regulations back then. That's the green monster as it looked during that World Series. They put people out on the berm there for the game. You know this fellow, the athletics manager in the series, the great Connie Mack. In 1914, the Athletics were surely the greatest team in baseball. They had won 6 American League pennants over a 13-year period and 3 World Series in the previous 4 years, but they just went cold this time and lost 4 straight to the Miracle Braves. I grew up in Westborough, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and I attended high school there at what looks like a medium security prison. Way back in April 1973, when I was 15, I skipped the school to go to opening day at Fenway Park. And the next day I brought in a note saying, please excuse Edward because he was not feeling up to school. The vice principal gave me a very dirty look. And when I got to my first class, a girl came up to me and said, did you see the front page of the Boston Globe sports section? I said, no, here it is. That's me on the right being pointed to my seat at Fenway Park by the usher. So I was busted. Of course, I had hair back then. Well, I've always loved baseball, and I love early baseball, especially because it's so colorful and filled with stories that have never been told or only told rarely. And the Summer Beer and Whiskey looks at a wonderfully entertaining and all but forgotten major league in the 1880s, the American Association. Its detractors dubbed it the Beer and Whiskey League because saloon owners, beer brewers, and distillers were prominent owners. But it was this league, I think, that helped save baseball when it was in danger of petering out and made it truly America's game. I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about the Philadelphia Athletics, the grittiest and greatest team of that season. But first, let's take a quick look at the man who founded the St. Louis Cardinals franchise, originally called the Browns. Chris Von der Ray was an immigrant from Germany who ran a grocery store and a saloon, catering mostly to the immigrants in his neighborhood. He knew next to nothing about baseball, but was fascinated in the activities at the ballpark located just down the street. A series of native-born Americans had tried to make a go of baseball, but they had utterly failed. The game had been destroyed by gambling, corruption, and people didn't like the nasty experience at the ballpark. And this was true all over the country, including in Philadelphia, and professional baseball was nearly dead. Von der Ray, this immigrant grocer, decided he could do what the native-born Americans couldn't. He took his life savings and put it all into baseball. And his formula was to hire honest players, to sell beer at the ballpark, to have Sunday games, and to charge a cheap admission, about exactly half of the National League admission. He also threw in some showmanship, doing things like introducing fireworks at the ballpark. He helped create a new league where all this was possible, and he ended up making a fortune. This is his team in 1883 posing in front of the new scoreboard he installed, and he's standing there in the middle looking a little bit like Charlie Chaplin. But I thought I'd read a little from the book about him, if you're interested. Many contemporary accounts, including from people who admired him, attest that he never quite seemed to grasp the intricacies of baseball. Quote, often after his team lost a game, his longtime manager, Charlie Comiskey, recalled, Chris would dash into the club's dressing room, single out a certain player and shout, "Why did you drop that ball, eh?" He took every muff as a personal affront and seemed to think that poor players could explain in well-chosen words why they happened to muff. On other occasions, he tried to inspire players with clubhouse addresses characterized by his memorable flair for language. One reporter claimed he once delivered this warning about lushing or excessive drinking. "See here now, I don't want some foolishness from you fellows. I want you to stop this slushing and play ball. If you win the championship, I give you all a suit of clothes and a benefit game extra. And if you don't, you will have to eat snowballs all winter." His use of English made even his friends laugh. Longtime Baltimore Orioles manager Billy Barney recalled introducing a couple of traveling reporters to the St. Louis owner one day, back when it was rare for sports writers to accompany teams on road trips. "Boys, I'm awfully glad to see you and welcome you to St. Louis," Wanderé declared. "Over there is my box. It is at your disposal." Admonished once for letting some good players go, Wanderé wrung his hands and moaned, "Why, oh, why didn't I take mine own advice?" So he was quite a character. This is Wanderé's loudmouth third baseman, Arlie Latham, who was known as the freshest man on earth. He was also very fast. Wanderé told people, "That boy Latham can run like a cantaloupe." Charlie Comiskey, who went to the Hall of Fame as a player, manager, and owner, the guy who built Comiskey Park, is here. He looks cherubic here, but he was a fierce competitor, and he was particularly hated in Philadelphia. When the Browns came to town in June 1883, a Philly paper called them about the toughest and roughest gang that ever hit this city. Vile of speech, insolent in bearing, they set at defiance all rules. The captain is an illiterate individual named Comiskey, whose sole claim to distinction rests upon his glib use of profane language. This is William Hulbert, the very stern president of the established National League, which in 1883 included the Phillies for the first time. Since the league banned Sunday games and beer sales and charged a steep admission price of 50 cents, all designed to improve the game's reputation and keep the riffraff out, he was horrified by the freewheeling beer and whiskey league. But because of the association's policies of beer, Sunday ball, and cheap admissions, attendance exploded. Working people who toiled 6 days a week could attend games on Sundays, out west anyway, not in Philly, and especially could afford 25 cents. Baseball became wildly popular and more truly America's game. People who play vintage baseball know about this, but one of the amazing thing about baseball in this era was that it was played barehanded, and players had the broken and shattered hands to prove it. Catchers wore some protection on their palms, but their fingers were exposed to foul tips. This is what one early catcher, Doug Allison, ended up looking like. That's the other side. This is, I think the US government took these pictures to keep in their files so they could, for some reason, to look at what broken fingers look like. Here's what it looked like in the stands in 1883, the year I focus on most in the book. Interestingly, the owners were so cheap that they tried to use only one baseball per game instead of the 100 plus today. If it was hit into the stands, fans were required to throw it back onto the field. By the end of the game, the ball was often filthy with dirt and tobacco juice, torn, mushy, and hard to hit for distance. So that helped the pitchers back then. Owners like to have women in the crowd to civilize the men and make them less rowdy and violent. But they also kept some guys from paying any attention to the game, as in this picture. Crowds could be quite rowdy. They like to make fun of upper class types like this fellow. Here they're yelling, "Shoot the hat," which usually involved throwing a rock at someone's head. Crowds in the city of brotherly love were known to be especially tough. Only one umpire worked a game, again to save money. Players exploited the situation to cheat all they could. For example, by running from second home without touching third base while the umpire's attention was diverted to a ball in the outfield. And being a lone umpire could be very dangerous. On June 11th, a mob from the tough Kensington district in North Philadelphia swarmed the field after an athletics loss and literally threatened to kill the umpire. Acting quickly, the players formed a human shield around him and hustled him to the relative safety of their dressing room, while the mob followed, hooting, yelling, and throwing sticks and stones. For more than an hour, the ump waited inside. Finally, hoping the mob had cooled down, he ventured out of the ballpark and onto the streets. Instantly, he realized he had made a serious mistake. Quote, "The struggle was so severe that he was forced to barricade himself in a nearby home owned by a custom house official. While he ate supper inside, the mob taunted him. When he tried to escape after dinner to a waiting carriage, a fight erupted. Brown's third baseman, Arlie Latham, got roughed up, while the driver's lips were badly cut by a flying brickbat. But the umpire somehow escaped alive." This is one of the American Association's catchers, a man named Moses Fleetwood Walker. He was the first recognized Black to play Major League Baseball, and he had much in common with Jackie Robinson, who finally broke the color line. He was very talented, college educated, and had extraordinary powers of self-control to deal with the abuse that came his way. It was interesting researching this. I discovered there were also professional all-Black teams in 1883, precursors to the Negro Leagues, and I write about them a little in the book. One of the marvelous things about early baseball is how colorful the sports writing is. And this is O.P. Kaler, a Cincinnati sports writer who could dish it out pretty good. But he was often attacked by other sports writers. And I'll read a little example I love. Let's see. Oh, the Louisville Commercials correspondent even took out his frustrations on a Cincinnati sports writer, O.P. Kaler, claiming that Kaler, whom he dubbed the Ghoul because of his pale, slender appearance, had badly skewed his coverage. Quote, "Physically, he is a ghost with less blood in him than the meek and lowly turnip, which has been his principal diet for the last 62 years. Mentally, he is one of the 9 goose eggs that the Cincinnatis earned in the first game at Louisville last week. As a whole, he is that part of a horse's anatomy which is always nearest to the dashboard." So that's how they wrote about each other in the 1880s. Here's a man, Lou Simmons, who was vitally important to baseball history in Philadelphia. In the 1860s, he emerged as one of the most famous minstrel stars in America, a comic song and dance man, hence this songbook, which was sold at his performances in Philadelphia. Around the same time, he played as an amateur for the Philadelphia Athletics, and he was a strong hitter and a good runner. After the National League threw out Philadelphia in the 1870s, crowds dwindled and professional baseball collapsed in the city in the late 1870s. And he worked with two other men, Billy Sharsig and Charlie Mason, to bankroll a new athletics team and bring it back to life. I'll read a little bit about what they were up against. If my cat will let me. Here we go. According to Al Spink, Sharsig's capital consisted of a stocking of gold, the life savings of his old mother, which he had borrowed. They brought Simmons on as an experienced theatrical manager and diehard baseball lover. He would serve as their business manager. For a time, it appeared Sharsig had squandered his aged mother's nest egg. When I went around the newspaper offices and asked for them to publish some baseball matter, he recalled, they said, "Billy, get out. We have no time to talk about a dead crow." Sharsig found he had to bribe editors to put squibs about the Athletics into the papers. Perhaps this from the Philadelphia item in June 1881 was one of them. Quote, "Baseball is destined to be as popular as ever in the city. The Athletics were the entering wedge to this return of enthusiasm over the game." Here's Lou Simmons in blackface with his banjo. He introduced some famous songs to the stage, including one during the Civil War called "When Johnny Comes Marching Home." He did a lot of topical humor, popularizing a song called "The Baseball Fever," and one making fun of German immigrants called "The Man What Likes the Lager Beer." And he made so much money from running his minstrel show that he was able to build the Arch Street Theater, seen here around the turn of the 20th century. And here's Lou Simmons' theater in modern times as the Trocadero Theater, which I think shut down in 2019. Baseball at that time was played in wooden stadiums built quickly and not particularly well. During the 1883 season, the upper deck at this park, Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, swayed when the fans were leaving and threatened to crash down. Fortunately, no one was killed. The 1883 A's played at Athletic Park, 26th and Jefferson, the site of the first National League game in history in 1876. It was very conveniently served by 5 horse-car lines. It had been abandoned for a time, but the A's moved back in hastily in 1883 when their other grounds were sold out from under them. Here's a rather ghostly 1884 view of the park. This is the brilliant team that Simmons and his associates built with little Bobby Matthews in the pitcher's box and the great Harry Stovey at first base. Here's Harry Stovey. He was a 3 tools guy, hitter, thrower, and runner. Graceful and tough, he set what was then a major league record for home runs in 1883 with 14. Here's a rare photo of the A's that year. Harry Stovey is in the top row on the far left, and Bobby Matthews is sprawled on the ground on the left. A very tough, very smart, very talented little pitcher, 5'5" and 140 pounds. I love this picture. His mustache is almost bigger than he is. He was teammates at one time in Providence with old Hoss Radbourn, and they both died later horribly of syphilis in the same year, which always made me wonder if they picked it up at the same time and place. Bobby is the 25th winningest pitcher of all time with 297 lifetime wins. All the rest of the people with that many wins are in the Hall of Fame except Roger Clemens. Anyway, Bobby was the key pitcher for the A's in 1883, their highest paid player and crucial to their pennant chances. And he sustained several injuries this season. Even though he was limping onto the field, he kept going. But he got so injured, he had to finally sit down, and their pennant hopes seemed doomed. I'm almost done here. Leaning jauntily in the center of this picture is a young man who was the son of America's first woman dentist. He was a superb whistler, a member of the Yale Glee Club, and a star pitcher for the Yale team, which is depicted here. He also had the funniest pitching motion in baseball history. In an act of outright desperation, the Philadelphia Athletics signed him at the end of the season. And I'll read a little bit about what happened in his first game. Dan Jones strode to the pitcher's box in front of the biggest crowd that had ever watched him play. The fanatics seemed more subdued than they had been on Monday, perhaps sensing the implications of this game. This strange young man with a cocky demeanor, dark mustache, and sparkling eyes held the fate of the 1883 season in his hands that day. Quote, there was perfect silence when he took his position, the Philadelphia Times reported. Bill Gleason, the brawny volunteer fireman, decidedly no college man, took his place in the batter's box and glared at the rookie. Jones nervously pitched 3 balls wide of the plate. He got the ball back and held it in his hands for a while, staring at his catcher. Jones knew what he had to do. And then he jumped 2 feet in the air. And while Gleason gazed at him in astonishment, the ball traveled squarely over the center of the plate, and 1 strike was called, the Times said. Jumping Jack jumped again, and Gleason aimed at a ball 2 feet from the end of his bat. He jumped again on the next ball, and Gleason was called out on strikes. Vonderay and the Philadelphia crowd could barely believe it. It was ridiculous, ludicrous. Spectators looked at each other, laughed, and pointed in amazement as Jones made a celebrated leap 3 or 4 times per inning, usually when there were 2 strikes on the batter. Quote, no one else can get it. It is taught exclusively at Yale, the Philadelphia Press informed its readers. His antics in the pitcher's box by jumping up and cracking his heels on every other ball pitched was very amusing to the crowd. It was less so to the Browns hitters who had trouble adapting. You don't know whether Jones or the ball is coming for you, one player explained in frustration. Through 5 innings, Jumping Jack led 6-1. Then he poured it on, retiring the last 12 men in succession. In the 8th inning, with the Athletics leading 11-1, the deliriously happy crowd began taunting the Browns by whistling the Dead March in unison. When Jones struck out the last batter to end the game, recapturing first place for the Athletics, spectators flung their derby hats in the air and jumped onto the field. They quickly surrounded the pitcher, heaved him up, and bore him on their shoulders to the dressing room. Quote, the Yale boy was an instant Philadelphia sports hero. Quote, the most popular man who ever played ball on the athletic grounds, the Philadelphia Press declared the next day. Here's a cartoon by a Philadelphia paper joyfully celebrating the totally unexpected turn of events. It shows Lou Simmons playing with a jumping jack toy, saying, "This is what beat you, Vonderay." And the St. Louis owner replies, "Was that so? Well, by time I get me 2 jumping jack pitchers when I get me mit St. Louis." And here are the people of Philadelphia going absolutely wild for baseball at the end of the season, with the biggest turnout for a parade since the end of the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the parade route. And these are some of the floats from the parade. And here's a close-up. All along the route, Philadelphians held up jumping jack figures in honor of the man of the hour. It says, "Our jumping jack." And I love this cartoon of the Athletics, a march of the Athletics with the owners out front hauling a big bag of cash. or big bags of cash. And all the players badly crippled from battling so hard to the end. In fact, what would have been baseball's first World Series, the A's against the Boston Bean Eaters, was canceled because the Athletics were simply too banged up. The A's never won another American Association pennant. Lou Simmons blew through all his baseball money and had to return to the minstrel stage. And for the rest of his life, he regaled people with tales of this season. The A's folded in 1890, and the American Association merged with the National League in 1892. 4 American Association franchises are still going strong today: the St. Louis Cardinals, the Cincinnati Reds, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Los Angeles Dodgers, which formerly of Brooklyn. The Athletics name, meanwhile, was such a nostalgic favorite that Connie Mack chose it for his American League team after the turn of the century. Several of the players on the 1883 Athletics continued to root for the Athletics in the American League, including Harry Stovey, even after he moved back to his hometown of New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is pretty close to me. Well, that's a very brief look at a momentous season in baseball, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Before we jump into that, thanks, Ed, for your presentation. Really appreciate you jumping on tonight. Some SABR news. If you are unaware, Bobby Matthews is going to get a new headstone very soon, courtesy of the SABR Grave Marker Project. He's going to be the recipient for this year or next year, I think. And if you haven't been down to Baltimore's new Cathedral Cemetery, it's like a foot tall stone without any writing on it. You can't see anything. So happily, we'll have a new stone for Bobby. And SABR over the past couple of years has had some writers working up an 1883 A's book with player bios and everything like that. That should be available on the SABR bookstore fairly shortly. I know contributing authors have received their hard copies already. And so with that said, before I kick it over, there's also a sign dedicated to the athletic baseball grounds in North Philadelphia. And as I minimize everything, as I was spelunking around looking for information, I decided to do some photo editing, really crude photo editing here, and I hope we can see it with Harry Stovey leading off second base at what is still a ball grounds where the old ballpark was, Athletic Park at 27th and Jefferson Streets. So with
awesome.
that said, let's kick it over to Ed for some questions.
I have a question. This is Glenn in Columbus, Mississippi. Some argue that the National Association should be considered as a major league. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I think it should be. I think it should be. I mean, that was the height of professional baseball at the time. The best players were involved in it. I know the statistics are a little more meager, but you know, I always look at those players as being major leaguers myself when I go back and look at those times. So I would agree with that. What do you think?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think you can make an argument either way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't as sophisticated as the National League in 1876, but you know, it was a developing sport, really. So
if I could ask one other question, you mentioned the 1884 series was the first World Series. There was an attempt in 1882, as you know, to have one, but after 2 games it was 1-1 and they called it off. I know a lot of people think the 1882 was the first World Series. Your opinion?
Yeah, I think that was a scheduled series. I think I studied this at one time. I don't remember exactly, but I think that that really was a series scheduled well before the pennants were won by the two teams, and they were part of just like a barnstorming tour. So it's not really the same thing as like dedicated games against the two winners of their leagues, which the 1884 clearly was. And they tried to set it up in 1883, as I said, but the Athletics bailed out of it because they were too seriously injured.
Ed, I do have a question. It's an odd topic to pick out, the 1883 season, and if any of you have read the book, you really do a terrific job of narrating it and making it really exciting. But why the 1883 season? When did you first read about it? When did you decide to do a book about it that warranted a book length treatment?
I grew up, as I mentioned, in Boston. I loved the Miracle Braves, and I read Harold Casey's book about the Boston Braves, and he talked about the original Miracle Braves were the 1883 Boston Red Stockings, or Bean Eaters, whatever you want to call them. And they came from, I think, 7th place to 1st place in that pennant. It was one of the great pennant fights of all time. So I thought, oh, I'd love to write about that. So I did an article for my newspaper about it at the time, and that got a lot of play. And when I went to Washington as a journalist, and I decided I really want to explore this season in early baseball and try to tell a story about it. And so I went every night after work to the Library of Congress. And this was before all this stuff was digitized. And I would look up the microfilm of all these papers. And I looked up every single major league city they had the reporting about it. And that formed my sort of database for what I did with both the Old Hoss Radbourn book and this book. And I loved Chris Avondere. I sort of was swung, and I loved the Philadelphia Athletics with Jumping Jack Jones. I was just sort of swung away from the Boston Red Stockings to the American Association. And it's such a great American story about these immigrants changing baseball. The German, especially the German immigrants, had a different cultural approach to life than people on the East Coast, where Sunday was closed down because of blue laws and because of the heavy Protestant sway of the East. And out in the Midwest, the Germans who flocked to that region wanted to enjoy Sunday activities with the family and on their own, and drinking beer and all that stuff. And here comes this crazy German immigrant who knows nothing about baseball and invests in it and makes a huge splash of it. So I love that story about him. I love, how this minstrel star forms this team in Philadelphia and makes baseball wildly popular there too. It had been really dying out. The National League threw out Philadelphia, I guess, after the 1876 season. And so here they come along and they invest everything and they bring it back to life. So I love that story. And the season is so great. It's so colorful. Such funny characters, and the sports writers are maniacs, and the whole thing is just great. And it's when you look, I'm sort of a micro historian. I look at contracted periods of time to explore history. And when you look at a single season, you get the whole feel for baseball, like the pacing of it and what the twists and turns and all that stuff. And you don't get that by looking at 20 seasons of something. So that's why I took this approach. And the book, people love the book. I mean, it's still selling all these years later. And I'm very happy about that because it's baseball is such a wonderful window on American culture, any period you look at it. And I'm happy SABR did a book on the team, and I'm thrilled about the Bobby Matthews monument. That's great. He's such an overlooked pitcher, and here he is, the only one in the top 25 not in the Hall of Fame. So he really belongs there.
As an anecdote, one of my favorite excerpts from this book is when you describe the scene at Athletic Park on Memorial Day or Decoration Day. And Bobby Matthews has to climb the fence to get in because the police have barricaded it. And you explained that the depressed folks who couldn't get into the ballpark were relegated to going to watch the National League Phillies. And the anecdote is we no longer have that luxury.
Yes, yes. Yep, yep. But really, it's interesting how popular the A's were compared to the Phillies. I mean, of course, the Phillies were the last place team and they were getting throttled by everybody. But yeah, isn't that, it's just fun reading about how baseball operated back then.
And it's really a treat to see you again after all of these years. And I think we're going to see you again in November. Providence.
Yeah,
but I wanted to mention something about the American Association. The following year, I just happened to do a ton of research and wrote too many words about Dude Estabrook.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So in 1884, Estabrook was deemed the American Association batting champion. And it was actually, what was the origins of that? I mean, he's listed as batting something like 408, some number like that, when in fact it wasn't corrected until I think the Macmillan Encyclopedia.
Yeah.
They made it like 314 or something like that. It was still a good batting average with about 408. But it's an interesting thing about, Spalding, in a sense, was the embodiment of the National League. And at the end, he ends up on top, by 1892, of course, as you mentioned, the association, was kind of merged with the National League. 4 teams were released and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. What happened was Chadwick was the editor of Spalding's Guide. And right there, when I got to that point about Estabrook, I tried to go to the source, and going to the source, you find out that what Chadwick actually says about the AA statistics is don't believe anything you're reading here. The only reason that we're publishing these numbers is just to document who played in the association, because they knew the numbers were wrong. And after that, I think Mutri became known as, who of course was the manager of the Metropolitan. Mutri became known as Truthful Jim.
Truthful Jim.
So,
one of the great sarcastic nicknames of all time.
Exactly.
That's great.
And by the way, just congratulations on your book on Lincoln.
Well, thank you.
I haven't read it yet. My cousin, a lady, very wonderful lady, called me, and it was her reading club's book. And she happened to read in the dust jacket that it was about your baseball history. And she said, I must know, I have to ask Peter if he knows this guy.
Oh, good. Well, I hope you enjoy it. It's a similar thing. It's micro history. I looked at just one day of Lincoln's life and all the people floating around him, and it's very poignant when you look at all the suffering in that war through the vantage point of just one day. And I tried to take an approach very similar to the baseball books, which was to tell a good story and to include as much color as possible and give the reader a feeling for the personality of the people who were there and capture some of the chaos. I mean, sometimes when you're writing as an omniscient historian 30,000 feet up in the air, you're not as attuned to how confused people were on the ground. They had no idea what was going to happen next. They had suffered terribly, and you just looking at one day or even one season for baseball of people, you really feel their struggles and their passions and their sorrows. And so I try to bring that out in these books.
Ed, this is Paul Langendorfer from Buffalo, New York. I read your book years and years ago. I love it. Most of us are, doing our own research, whatnot. My question is this: you're a storyteller, which is absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I appreciate you telling us a little about the research. But how do you actually convince, say, your publishers or the powers that be that this is a book that people will want, this is a book that people will be interested in reading, and the reception and that sort of thing? I don't know if you could maybe just elaborate a little bit on that, if that's possible.
Yeah, well, it's damned hard, I'll tell you that. I tried to sell what became the Summer of Beer and Whiskey 20 years before it was published. And I had to get out the old Haas book before a publisher would take a look at it. And it turned out to be a very successful book. I mean, still doing very well. If it would have been on the New York Times bestseller list if it had sold all at once, but instead it was spread out over many years. So it made them a lot of money. What you have to do is get a good agent. You have to study the market. You have to convince an agent that your book will sell. And then at the end, it's all a crapshoot. You never know whether something will sell or not. So I don't know if that's a good answer. You have any other thoughts?
No, it was just, I think that's great. I was just curious because I'm like you. I love the little inside stories, the micro histories. I do some writing for a local website here called Buffalo Rising, and I like to just put the little things out there, that people aren't aware of. So
Yeah, wonderful.
I've written about Jimmy Collins, if you're a Boston guy, is buried in Lackawanna, New York. People don't know that. I used to drive when I was a kid all the time, and it's just those little neat little stories that I love reading, and your book brought out. So I appreciate that. I was just curious. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it and for your nice words. And I wish you luck. And I think that's great work you're doing, letting people know about the rich history of baseball in Buffalo. I mean, that's tremendous.
Ed, I got a question. The illustrations that you showed earlier with the fan interaction and the illustration of the umpire, where did those illustrations come from?
Yeah, the fan interaction stuff came from Leslie's Illustrated magazine from 1883. God knows how I found these, but I had to buy like original copies of them so I could use them in the book. And the picture of Jumping Jack, I love because it's actually drawn by Long John Riley, who was the first baseman of the Cincinnati Reds. And he was a graphic illustrator in the off season. And so he drew these very funny cartoons during the 1883 season. I think I have another one in the book of this Cincinnati player faking that he had cramps because the full team had not showed up at the ballpark. So they couldn't go out on the field because he had cramps. So he faked having cramps till the player showed up. And this was Major League Baseball in the 1880s. They couldn't make substitutions once the game got underway unless somebody was injured. So they had to sort of figure some way to stall until the player showed up. And Long John Riley drew a hilarious cartoon about that. which is in the book. So there's a lot of funny cartoons I discovered in these old newspapers. Not a lot, but a few. The one about Von der Ray and Lou Simmons and the jumping jack and all that stuff. And the pictures of the parade were from Harper's Weekly, which was a very popular illustrated newspaper at the time. And they're great lithographs of what was going on in that parade. The parade got national attention.
Steve, the issue you're looking for the Harper's Weekly is the October 13th, 1883 copy. It's very rare we get to put championship things up on our walls.
You have to go back to 83, huh?
I made sure I framed that one.
And that's the Boston team at the top of that. So there you go. Those are the two leagues I was looking at. And so
you talk about the parade at the end of the book, and it's a really fascinating thing because they show up from Louisville basically in the middle of the night, right? And the entire city's waiting for them as they get off the train.
Yeah, it's the first sign of this sort of like real baseball mania. And that came out from this league. It was really, there was a lot of interest with the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings because they were a sort of a celebrated thing. But this was sort of mass interest in this team. And Philadelphia was just beside itself with happiness. It was just a great time to be in the city back then.
Was there anything similar for Boston from the National League in 83?
They were ecstatic and wildly happy, but they didn't have a big parade like that. Philly just went nuts for this team. They just embraced it. And nothing, it was a front page story and there were parties and all this stuff, but there was nothing like that giant parade.
And you talk about passionate fan bases. You mentioned basically a lot of the Northeast fan bases, and then Chicago, St. Louis, of course. In 83, when the Phillies played the A's in the first city series that they would embark on for that decade, it's written in some newspaper, I forget whether it's local or the Sporting Life, but the author mentions that the fans at Athletic Park commented, cheered, and jeered on all of the play that was going on in the practice prior to the game. And they weren't amused. So people got booed a lot in practice before a game that didn't matter.
Yeah, it's I don't know if I mentioned this in the context of that, but the audiences at the American Association games were very different from the National League. The National League was really trying to keep everybody in line, try to be well behaved. And these newspapers would write these critical pieces when the audience jeered players or booed them or anything like that. You're supposed to be good sports and sit there, and like the American Association, all that was out the window. They would scream at these players and they would use foul language, which was really on the edge in the 1880s. So, and this was part of the argument. The National League said this is a despicable league because they have all these rowdies at their ballparks, and I think that kind of prejudice against the American Association sort of continues to this day. Because if you'll notice, these really incredible people like Von der Ray aren't in the Hall of Fame. When he did so much to sort of create baseball's rebirth, and they just looked down at him as a fool and an imbecile, and they still look down on the American Association. And it wasn't at the start, it wasn't as good a league as the National League, but by the late 1880s, it was as good as the National League, the mid to late 1880s. And, they still give short shrift to these American Association players, including Bobby Matthews. I mean, Harry Stovey. I'm not sure he's Hall of Fame, but he's on the edge, I think. And, so I guess when Spalding took over the game, and he made it the national game, and he invented the Doubleday myth and all that stuff, he was very down on the American Association. So they got, no attention from the Hall later on when they started bringing in players.
Did any of their fans ever throw snowballs at Santa Claus?
Not sure about they would throw bottles and stuff like that. As I read, they literally threatened the life of this umpire and threw brick bats at the carriage, taking away. And this is hours after the game. So the Philadelphia crowds were notoriously tough, at least the
Even
American
back then.
Association. Even back then, yeah.
I think Chris von der Aha would roll over in his grave if he realized how much more money he could have made off of beer if he saw today's beer prices at Major League ballparks. I wonder what the inflation would look like if he got it right the first time.
Well, that's the thing. Back then, people, is the other thing you realize looking at history. These ball players played their hearts out and played with injuries and really did a number on themselves, had very short careers, because the alternative was working in the factories for no money or working on a farm, which was even worse. And so they really played hard for these jobs. And the fans didn't have a lot of disposable income back then. So selling a beer or two at the ballpark was very good business for Von der Ray, or Aha, however you pronounce it. I mean, I pronounce it Von der Ray because there was a moving company in St. Louis with a slogan, "All the way with Von der Ray." So that's why I felt like,
That's good.
I'm sure in the original German is Von der Ache or something like that. So.
You mentioned two players and an owner that should be considered for the Hall of Fame. Is there anybody else that you think should be worthy of the Hall of Fame induction?
From this period,
From the American Association.
Yeah. I haven't made a careful study of that to answer the question. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But I'd look at
Bob Folkers from Minneapolis. Not the last question. Tony Mullane is mentioned a lot. He won almost as many games as Matthews.
Yeah.
And was also a colorful character.
Yeah.
Which doesn't qualify you for the Hall of Fame in a lot of cases. But and he could pitch with either arm.
Yes.
He was famous for that.
Yeah.
By Hall of Fame standards, he was, he was famous. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. He's involved with a rather ugly story with Moses Fleetwood Walker. I don't know if you've heard of that. Moses Fleetwood Walker was the black player. He was his catcher, and Walker would signal for a pitch, and Mullane, who didn't like blacks, would cross him up. So he'd throw a fastball if he signaled for a curveball or something. Finally, Moses Fleetwood Walker said, "Look, I'm not going to give signs anymore. You just throw whatever you want." And that's what he did. So it was a rough time back then. But you mentioned he used both arms. I mean, this is 1880s baseball. They would do all sorts of stuff. How did Old Hoss throw 678 innings in a single season? I mean, he threw underhand, he threw sidearmed, he would take a running start. He could supposedly throw a fastball as fast as Walter Johnson, said people who saw him, but I'm sure he didn't do that very often during the game. So they would do all sorts of tricks to keep the batters off guard. And they had no gloves, so they could do either arm. And old Haas didn't do that, but Mullane did. So it's very interesting looking at the early game, how much trickery was involved. It was, it was different from modern baseball, but they still were very serious about this game and trying to win these games. Very serious.
They wouldn't have called it trickery. They might have called it points of play.
Yeah, there you
Which is what
go.
They called it in the 60s.
Yeah, there you go. But they do trickery too. I mean, King Kelly was famous for skipping third by 10 feet as he ran from second to home. And they also, in this period, they were experimenting with the rules for throwing overhand or sidearm. And you weren't supposed to throw the ball over the shoulder. But the players so routinely violated that rule that they changed it in 1884. You could throw over the shoulder starting
It was
that
one
year.
of those rules that was too tough on the umpires to
Yeah.
last.
There were too many fights and the
Finally just had to
umpire.
make it. Anything goes.
Yeah, exactly.
People didn't like Billy McLean enough, and then if he's going to call people on where they're throwing their arm slot, the dead man, regardless if he's a pugilist or not. Does anybody
you
else
know
have
these people.
Anybody else want to add anything or have any other questions for Ed before we wrap up?
I would like to say you're an interesting company here, Ed, because our 19th century committee has recently completed its Overlooked Legends, 19th century baseball Overlooked Legends. And what they did different this year was they categorized, they created 4 categories. And one, of course, is for Black players of the 19th century. Another was for just other players, professional players in the majors. Another was managers, executives, and umpires. And another was early pioneers, somebody pioneer. But who came in? Well, our reach came in overall as an early pioneer. The highest player was the second person in the entire pool, who was Bobby Matthews. And who is the highest manager and 4th overall is Chris Vondar.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because, a lot of people are thinking that way now.
Yeah.
About what about these American Association guys,
Yeah, that's good. But they're still biased towards reach. So there you go.
No comment.
One of the first professionals reach.
No, reach was truly deserving. Yeah, I agree.
He was a top one of the top infielders of his day.
Yep.
Around the
Yeah,
Civil
he
War.
was.
I think what gets missed with Bobby Matthews is he pitched in a unique period. He pitched in the amateur era. He pitched in the National Association, the National League, and the American Association. He pitched when you couldn't go above the hip all the way to overhand pitching.
That's
and
right.
He was effective throughout the entire pitching revolution process. Right?
Yeah.
So that is something that I think is sort of a feather in Matthews' cap if he were to ever be considered for the Hall of Fame. He might not have the most wins. Maybe he wasn't as talented as Jim McCormick, we'll say, for example, just throw something out there. But that sort of unique career, I think, deserves recognition.
Yeah. Yeah. And, he played his heart out in this season, in this book. I mean, he injured his leg. He came back. He was limping. He injured himself further. And he played his heart out. And that's the reason the A's won. I mean, they had to bring in this college kid at the end. But, you look at the toughness of these players and it's just staggering.
There
And they
wasn't
didn't
any
cut-
injured list to go on.
Yeah, that's
They only
right.
kept 12 players on the roster.
Right. And no money if you're injured. Yeah, that's it. You don't play, you don't get paid. So it was tough. It was tough then.
Anything else?
Well, great. It was an honor to talk to all of you and to get your questions. Those are terrific. It was a great discussion.
Great
I wrote
job.
this book 12 years ago, so you pardon me if I can't remember all of it. I haven't read it lately. I've been working so deeply on Lincoln. I got another book coming out next February on him. So right in the middle of copy editing for that. So that's been my focus, but I love early baseball. So it's really fun to come back and talk to you guys about it.
Well, I know I appreciate you jumping on here with the Connie Mack Dick Allen chapter in Philadelphia. And I know our 19th century committee folks, myself included, look forward to seeing you in Rhode Island later this
Oh,
year.
yes. Yeah.
There's not enough at Achorn to go around.
That's I'll be talking about the other book at that one. So,
Right. Get a well-rounded presentation.
yeah.
Well, thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. And everyone else, I appreciate you jumping on and joining us for tonight. I'll have this up on the chapter's YouTube channel so you can re-listen at your leisure.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Matt.